Hello, everyone. May I please ask you to take your seat? We'd like to get started. Thank you for joining us. For those of you who've just joined us and were not here for the earlier part, I'm Hitesh Hathi. I'm with the Mittal Institute. The Mittal Institute is a cross-disciplinary research institute based at Harvard. We've been around for a long time. Tarun Khanna, who's here, is our faculty director. We do work in a wide variety of fields. I don't want to take too much time, but everything from study of ancient manuscripts to how markets are formed in South Asia to healthcare and climate change. And we do interdisciplinary research involving everything from humanities, Kennedy School, Divinity School. We work with every school within the university, and we work all over South Asia. We are present on the ground in every country in South Asia, and in Delhi, we have a very large full-fledged office, which has helped us organize this. So please look us up on the website to learn more about us. I want to just turn to this panel without too much delay. I'll leave Tarun to introduce our very distinguished panelists, but for just 1 minute, may I have Sheil? Sheil, are you here? Sheil is the CEO of Fast India, and he's just going to say one quick word. Do you want to just come up and say a word?
Thank you. Well, first of all, good evening, everybody. And I'm not sure if we are on Zoom. If we are on Zoom, good morning to the team in the US as well. To introduce, I'm Sheil Kapoor. I'm the CEO for Fast India. I would like to thank Tarun, Monica, and Hitesh as having Fast as a partner for this panel discussion. FAST, the acronym is for Foundation for Advancing Science and Technology. And we are a non-profit organization based out of Delhi, which works on catalyzing the ecosystem on science and technology to make India a top 3 preferred destination on science and technology. We do a lot of work with the government in creating the right incentive for research and development in the country, research translation, and making easier rules for making research at institutions even more effective. So that's pretty much our manifesto. We also run the India Science Festival, which is called as India Science Fest. We did the last event in Pune, where we had about 30,000 people who came down to visit that. That's getting people excited on science and technology. Key part of our understanding is that higher education is a fulcrum for open-ended research. And as of today, the total spend on higher-end education has been fairly low in India compared to other economies. We hope this will get reformed in the years to come. There is also a need for greater autonomy in institutions to ease the research, and also the government is now giving higher funds. Some of you may have heard of ANRF and other missions which have been recently launched by the Indian government. So we try to work with the Indian government in some of these areas. New models are likely to come up as a result of these new missions which the Indian government is launching. And this is likely to be opportunities for the country as well as for us to make a difference in science and technology. We hope that these institutions will now move up the value chain as well as a result of this, and prioritize research rather than just teaching, which has been pretty much the focus area in the past. That's where we're looking forward to this panel discussion, and I want to again thank the Mittal Institute for giving us an opportunity to partner. Thank you.
Sheil, thank you very much. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be partnered with FAST for any kind of project. Without much ado, I want to just turn to our panel and get off stage for this discussion, which we at the Mittal Institute have been excited about for a while. And with this extraordinary panel, Tarun will introduce the panel. Let me just give you a 2-line introduction to Tarun for those of you who don't know him. So Tarun Khanna is the Jorge Paulo Lehmann Professor at the Harvard Business School. He's director, as I said, faculty director of our institute. He's been at Harvard for about 3 decades. He studies entrepreneurship. It's as a means to a social and economic development in emerging markets. He has degrees from Harvard and Princeton. His courses include courses on strategy, international business, and economic development to both undergraduate and graduate students. And he also teaches senior executives from around the world. So let me get off stage. Tarun, I'll give it over to you. Thank you all for joining us.
Okay, well, thank you, Hitesh, and welcome everybody. I'm just going to do a quick introduction of all our esteemed panelists, and then the model that we'll follow is in the order that they are seated. I've asked each of them to make 5-6 minutes of opening comments on how they see the possibilities of improving higher education in India in the years and decades ahead. And then I will moderate a short conversation based on what they say. And hopefully we'll have some time for opening up to the audience, because I know there are a lot of interested people here. But first of all, thank you all for coming and taking time from busy schedules. To my immediate left is Professor C. Raj Kumar, Raj for short, the founding Vice Chancellor of OP Jindal Global University. He's accumulated a long list of degrees from many eminent institutions. I won't list them here, including Harvard, but not limited to Harvard, and is generally an expert on law, on governance, law, human rights in particular is what I think of your work in primarily. And so thank you for coming. To his immediate left is Professor K. Vijay Raghavan, Vijay, as I know him, Emeritus Professor, former Director of NCBS, National Center for Biological Sciences, spectacular institute in Bangalore, which I know well. Served as the PSA, Principal Scientific Advisor to the Government of India from 2018 to 2022, and I had the pleasure of working closely with Vijay on many projects. Is an engineer from IIT Kanpur, and then a PhD biologist. Many accolades and awards to his credit. So we've got a lawyer and a biologist so far. To his left is Dr. Shamika Ravi, who I've just had the pleasure of meeting. Thank you, ma'am, for coming. Formerly at Brookings India, is an economist interested in development, and is now a member of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister and Secretary of the Government of India. Thank you, Dr. Ravi, for coming. So we've got an economist now. Moving further down, we have some sort of engineerish physicist, physics. Okay, electrical engineer, nanoelectronics. This is Ram Gopal Rao, who I've also had the pleasure of meeting in the past in his prior incarnation, Avatar, as director of one of the IITs, and now he's vice chancellor of Birla Institute of Technology and Sciences across all their campuses in India and overseas. Is an expert in nanoelectronics, and very well recognized at institutionalizing the science of nanosciences in India. So we've got an engineer, physicist at the end. So we've got a good spectrum. Let me just frame the conversation. I'm obviously an economist, applied mathematician, sitting at Harvard for a long time, and therefore interested in higher education. And by virtue of having studied as a child and young adult in India, and then building my career in the United States, I obviously have a comparative flavor. And it's always struck me that, no surprise to this audience, there are lots of Harvard alums in the room and would-be Harvard students, that there's no shortage of intellectual capital, intent, hard work in this country, as in most others. Somehow we don't hit the ball out of the park, so to speak, when it comes to research. And that's always been a frustration for many of us, and a puzzle. And my intent in convening this panel was to hopefully be constructive and think constructively with experts. All these folks have frontline seats. I'm an insider, well-wisher, outsider, really looking from the outside. And so I defer to their wisdom, but hopefully we can have a forward-looking conversation as opposed to what I would characterize as a whining conversation of what's wrong about things, which we all know and is probably not so productive, unless it is in the service of saying something constructive. Then, of course, we need to know what problem we're remedying. My mother taught Sanskrit and philosophy at the University of Delhi for many years when I was a kid, and I just remember her as being intensely intellectually interested and incredibly frustrated. And eventually she quit to go start schools, which she built from Standard 1 to Standard 12 twice, once in Delhi and once in Bangalore, and was very happy doing that. But I remember being left with this observation that I will never be an academic. I will never go into research. Yet here I am. Life has strange twists and turns. Some years ago, the Prime Minister asked me through the PMO to set up something called the Institutes of Eminence, which I didn't want to chair, but was convening. And the whole idea was there is a window of opportunity to try to think of alternative models of the university, of the future in India. The way it was phrased to me is, how come we don't have any universities in the top 100? And I am very familiar with China. I speak a little bit of Chinese. I built a company in China. And he said, I forget what it was. You've spent time in China. I've lectured in China. And he said, how come they have so many great universities now? And I said, if you have $100 billion, I can do it. It's not a problem. In essence, what they did was borrow Chinese talent that was already institutionalized overseas, but really free them from the regulatory shackles when they came back into Chinese universities, and hold their feet to the fire to produce something. And that's really all it took. So the lesson I took away from that was openness to talent. They used to have a program that awkwardly translates into 1,000 talents program, which is basically to identify 1,000 talented academics in all fields and make it easy for them to come. So I watched in frustration at so many stillborn efforts in our policy circles to say, let's at least go in something like that direction. The Institute of Eminence project, we were just talking, there are a couple of representatives and former representatives of Institutes of Eminence on the panel here. A great idea to liberate us from some of the regulatory shackles that constrain intellectual inquiry inadvertently, not by intent, I'm sure, but not quite fully delivered on. Could be revisited. I hope it is at some point. So what I take away from these personal experiences, whether it's 50 years ago watching my mom, or the Institutes of Eminence, or my comparative experiences in China, is that really at a conceptual level, it's not that hard. We have to let, if you'll permit economics speak for a second, markets for talent thrive. Try to allocate a little bit more to research. It's interesting that in the midst of all this, the ratio of money going into R&D as a ratio of GDP has, I think, been going down. It's certainly not been going up, which is really a shocking statement for someone to unfortunately have to make in a public forum. I don't see how we can be a 5 trillion or frankly a 4 trillion economy with no money going into any kind of research. No society has done it in recorded human history. So let me pause with that. If we had, I'm not even sure we need a little bit more resources. What we need is openness and allowance for unlimited creativity to actually do its thing. And with that, I'm going to hand off to my friend Raja. Maybe it's going to take 5-6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Tarun and the Lakshmi Mittal Institute for putting together this panel as well as having this conversation. I want to begin by saying that whenever we talk about India, it is a land of all kinds of paradoxical, outcomes. While this is the case, and what Tarun mentioned, when we are living through this, and there is so much of those of us who are in the field of higher education are also constantly frustrated and disappointed and almost feeling that we could be doing much better. And all those points about our aspiration and what we end up fulfilling is always a gap. So I want to quickly identify 3 major issues that I feel where we need to focus on. First is that we have still not recognized the role of the private sector in higher education. Even today, the reality of numbers is that 70% of Indian higher education institutions are in the private sector, and more than 70% of students in India are studying in private higher education institutions. There has been a tectonic shift in this movement from public to private. And despite this change that has happened, the larger regulatory thinking has not changed. And we need to really recognize that the role of the government in providing resources has vastly limited when it comes to public sector. And we need to recognize the extraordinarily significant role of private higher education institutions. Second, we have a major challenge with regard to regulation and governance. We are over-regulated and significantly under-governed. In fact, for those of us who are vice chancellors can tell you that almost every week we receive 4 to 6 letters from regulatory bodies telling us what we should do, from celebrating birthdays to recording those events to organizing, providing those recorded versions into pen drives and sending those pen drives to the regulatory bodies as proof and evidence that we have actually organized these birthdays. And I'm not saying this in a lighter vein. The kind of work that is assigned to universities in India by regulatory bodies is, if you simply end up doing that, you will have nothing but simply complying with constant directions and constant circulars, constant new policies, changed policies that are being put across. In addition to that, if you really want to be a vice chancellor in Indian university, you need to be a good lawyer, because almost all major higher education problems are now settled by the Supreme Court of India, including the NEET controversy that just happened. So basically, the entire higher education system is completely struggling with its own identity and a significant degree of imbroglio that has been constantly, mediated at the courts level. And with all due respect to our courts, they constantly give contradictory judgments, and people who are in higher education are hugely confused as to what one has to follow. The third aspect is that we have still not recognized the need for true level of internationalization. While the national education policy has given a very strong impetus to internationalization, the entire framework of internationalization, be it having international students or international faculty, require a reimagination of our visa regime, our FRRO regime, and a number of logistical barriers that are deeply institutionalized and embedded, with a view to ensuring that we simply can't even have a proper conference, let alone having a full-time faculty. Now, I'm talking about a university which ours, we have students from 105 countries and faculty from 51 countries full-time. Despite that, the kind of challenges that we face is incredible, and most of the time, one bangs at the wall whether all of this is worth it at all. So I want to end by saying that we cannot afford to do marginal reforms. In India, marginal reforms will lead to zero impact. We need extraordinary reforms which will have marginal impact.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. If you ask a Brit, how are you? You get the response, how are you? If you ask an Indian, how are you? You get an answer in great detail. And I have a headache and this and that, and my grandfather was like so, and that's why I'm like this. And so it's all very true, but you get that. Now, that's very important in the higher education sphere to understand the answer to this question, how are you? There's no question about that. And those details are critically important. And by the way, when I say higher education, I will make it as equivalent to research, because that's the component which I'm more comfortable talking about, though it links up to the higher education part. So the question is, we have a whole set of problems. Why do we have those problems? And what is the solution? And by solution, I mean a solution as distinct from the answer. The answer to a problem is, okay, the problem should go away. The solution is something which is solvable in that context. What can we do? So first of all, why do we have the kinds of problems we heard about from Raj? And I'm sure we'll hear about from Ram Gopal also. The reason is we are trying to deal with a country with a very large population, and we're trying to do both equity and excellence at the same time. And that is not easy. Given the size, the scale, and the nature of problems, it's not going to be easy. So you're going to constantly have, at the higher levels, at the high altitude level, when you look down, solutions which are trying to be all things to all people, as opposed to what we need, which are different things in different contexts. Your university needs something to be done in a certain way. Another university which could misuse these flexibilities need to be looked at in another way, and that's not easy to do at this high level. So that's the source of a lot of the problem, and we need to find solutions to that. Now, what's the solution? Now, if you look at research over the last 75 years, what has happened is that research institutions, as opposed to research in universities, has grown. It's also not, a rosy picture compared to what is there in the universities, but from Kashmir to Kanyakumari, you have research laboratories of the CSIR, DAE, Atomic Energy Space, DST, Department of Biotechnology, and so on, completely dotted over there. You put that map, which we have done, you can see them all over the country. On that same map, if you put in universities and colleges, central universities and state universities, it's packed. Every university has nearby a top research laboratory of not nearby, at least a few 100 kilometers or so. There's a complete disconnect between these two. All these really, some of the very good research laboratories are what I would call a short walk from India. So inverting the situation, making these laboratories somehow accessible to the universities is a way forward to push research into the university environment. That has to be done in a manner which overlays into the university system without becoming part of the bureaucracy of the university system. And we have instruments with us which allow that to happen. So that's one of the kinds of solutions which I think we could try and implement. The second kind of solution is that in the smaller universities, in the state universities itself, the National Research Foundation should try and do that. It's there in its mandate, is to populate central and state universities with centers of excellence around talented people who want to go and hire others. And again, this situation, this hiring, the NRF has got the flexibility to do that, is to hire people independent of the university system. In other words, just as you have the Harvard MIT Broad Institute, which is part of Harvard and MIT, but is independently operating, in a similar manner, you need institutions in every subject in these universities. The third and last point is to take our big clusters of institutions which we have. Hyderabad, for example, has 39 national laboratories. The South Delhi region has a chain of institutions contiguous with each other. If these were to merge functionally, not administratively, but merge functionally, so that students can go from one to another, which the NEP allows, but actually make that practical and have them as one umbrella universities, which the finance minister actually announced 3 years ago in a budget speech, which has not been implemented because of various reasons. If bottom up, there's a pull to implement that, overnight, these clusters with an umbrella university structure will be amongst, their rankings will go up rather substantially. That's a minor point, but they can also functionally be of really high quality. These are all doable things. They've been talked about. They've been, a lot of the paperwork has been done. We need both a top-down focus on this. I think the political level, the government has given these directions as they have for many big missions, such as the Deep Ocean mission, the Quantum mission, the Laser Interferometric Gravitational Observatory. The downstream agencies need to find ways within our complex system of spending the resources and getting things done. That's feasible, but that requires also a bottom-up desire to do it rather than only stating what the problem is. Thank you.
Well, I'll focus on two main aspects of higher education. One is, well, in 2005, when I came back to India, after finishing my PhD at NYU, my own mother was actually very dismayed. She said, "Why would you come back?" And since it's been long enough, but I must confess, whether it was my teaching tenure track and tenured position at the Indian School of Business, or setting up the Brookings Institution India Center, or even currently within the EAC, in some ways, our generation, Tarun, has to play the role of frontier people. We have to build these institutions. We are not getting any of these institutions on a platter. The revenue model around tuition, I think, is well understood, because the training aspect of higher education, India is actually managing to pace up at a certain decency. Of course, there, even the revenue model, one has to wonder that why is it that an average higher education institution in China is about 16,000 students. In India, it's around 650. So there is just a fundamental difference in this micro thinking, which again goes back to core economics of revenue of some of these businesses, right? Are you able to generate enough money to even carry out training, which has a robust, because people have a willingness to pay for this kind of training. Research, I think, is much more problematic, because I don't think too many people understand what research is. So, and I must confess, at each of these institutions, I've had to convince my boards, my bosses, my faculty to contribute in the form of, and of course, funders, that what is research and what is independent research at that. Now, unlike development, research, R&D that happens within the industry, which can then be developed towards a product or a service and priced appropriately, the kind of research all of us here do, it's more basic research. And what's the paper value of a paper that I might do on health, public health, or poverty? Nothing, really. I can't sell it. It might be of great relevance for public policy and welfare economics in the country, but it really does not generate, unless society, or at least the people who are making these policies, understand what the contribution is. I've had to sit through several board meetings convincing the board that if your faculty is doing research, you must make quality gradients. Writing in a Times of India is not the same thing as writing in Econometrica. And hence, incentivizing faculty for quality is actually something we should do. But then I get told, well, but the job of faculty is to do research, so why would you want to incentivize them? And these are not bureaucrats who most of my work, or at least in the Economic Advisory Council, most of our struggles are internal in nature, because you're trying to get a bureaucracy which has traditionally not been in these regions or areas of policy to appreciate. We are talking academics. We are talking people from industry who have to appreciate what quality of research, and how do you incentivize faculty? How do you give time off from training? That research is a full-time job. Why is it that Delhi's all the meetings, Vijay, this of course you know this better, why does Delhi hold all important research conferences on weekends? For me, it's a full-time job. So I never understand, what is this? By the way, let's discuss research. I think one of the core struggles has been we have not had a champion. And I hate to say this, but this is a bit like preaching to the choir. We're all really on the same side because we want the same thing. We have to champion the cause of R&D, and I mean R&D of the kind we're talking about, not industry R&D which comes out in the form of a patent or a product or a service. That why should we be not just spending money, because the government's response to that is, we have set up foundations, we have set up different bodies, and we have done the allocation. So if you actually begin to do accounting from the last 10 years, significant amount of money has been put aside for research. How much of that is really getting spent? Why is it that faculty has such a difficult job actually getting those grants? And once you get the grant, you don't want to deal with government grants, mostly because the kind of paperwork that it entails, you would rather do without. So I think there is a core problem in understanding what research is. Then governance becomes that major cholesterol in the system, which is not allowing the funds to really find their way towards the talent which is in abundance. But I must tell you, as an economist and someone who's deeply concerned about broader welfare policies, my driving focus is suicide mortality rate among students in this country, particularly after school education. You have an epidemic. It's called a clustering of suicides after grade 12. And you have cutoffs which are what, 99, 100%. It makes no sense. So yes, we have talent, but we also have acute shortage of quality institutions. Our students deserve better. Also, the growth of existing institutions. In fact, the private institutions, Raj, I am happy to see they've had substantial growth. The public institutions are not keeping pace with the aspirations of in New India. And we, of course, we keep saying demographic dividend, but that window is actually going to close a lot sooner than and higher education becomes a very important cornerstone of harnessing that potential for the growth of this nation.
Thank you. I think what she said probably is a solution to what I'm going to pose as a problem. I spent 18 years at IIT Bombay as a faculty member, and I was the most positive person. Anybody who had interacted with me at that time, I would do research. I'm always, talking about the great things happening. Then I came to IIT Delhi as the director. And in my 6 years as a director, I interacted 5 secretaries of Ministry of Education, 5 secretaries and 4 ministers, right? After that, now I thought I just don't fit here, and I moved to a private institute. And in fact, every time some bolt falls from the ministry, we used to run to Vijay Raghavan. He was our principal scientific advisor. He also cannot do anything, but he's a very great counselor. You talk to him, everything looks all right. He is very nice that way. So I think, but that's the problem. I think these are all mostly the bureaucratic kind of problems right now. All Prime Minister's education advisor is an IAS, right? Ministry of Education is run by IAS. They have no understanding of anything. Every 1.5 years, somebody changes, and you explain everything. It seems to be there. The secretary has understood, now wants to do something, and next day in the newspaper, you read that somebody has changed. So that's the biggest challenge. Today, there are only 2 types of universities in this country. One type of universities which are 90% dependent on government of India for their sustenance, like IITs, universities, anything you take, and 90%, and other type which are dependent for 90% of their revenues from the tuition fee, right? Without tuition fee, they cannot even survive, whether it's any university you take right now, right? These are only the 2 types of universities. The reason for that is, if you look at the IIT system, right? Neither is education sustainable there, nor is research. If you look at IIT funding, how is IIT funded, right? Every year in the month of January, February, all directors go to ministry, sit with the secretary. Earlier, when there is a good secretary, you get to meet with the secretary and decide the funding, what will get allocated or what might get allocated, in April, May, June kind of a thing. But if the secretary doesn't care, then you only meet with additional secretary and even a director level person in the ministry. That's what happens. And then you negotiate now how much money and all of that. All the money that IITs receive, right, is only for payment of salaries, right, and the pensions, and then the students some scholarships. There is no money for anything else. In the current system, if I want to build some hostels, so I want to admit more students, I have to take loan. That HEFA loan, IIT Delhi has 800 crores of loan sitting on it right now, which it has to pay back. IIT Bombay has another 800 crores of loan, which they need to pay back. I mean, Harvard, what is the endowment? $80 billion or something? And we have 800 crores of loan on these institutions right now. That is how we are actually running. All the funding that institutions receive in the country are mostly for operational expenses. And there is no money that is provided for, any expansion. You look at IITs, when did IITs actually expand on their intake, right? The number of students that they admit, only 2 times. Once when Mandal Commission was introduced, that was 50% hike in the admissions, right? Because Mandal Commission mandated supernumerary quotas and all of that. 50% increase happened in IITs. When was the second time? EWS quota, which happened during my time, economically weaker section quota, again 25% increase in IITs. Other than these 2 times in the history of IIT, no IIT ever had any reason to increase the intake. Because if I increase intake, I don't get any extra money. I don't have money to build hostels to accommodate students. I can't even, build classrooms to accommodate students. In IIT Bombay, the situation was so bad that, in a classroom of 80 students, we used to have 120 students, 130 students, with the hope that students will not turn up, right? If all of them turn up, they have no place to sit. That was the terrible situation these institutions are right now. That is why, because it's essentially the financial model. The financial model doesn't incentivize any outcomes. The outcomes, what is the enrollment? Do I want to increase number of students? There is no reason why I would like to do that, because I have no extra money that I get because of that. Do I want to do research? IIT Delhi, I can show you the data, 5 years of data on the research projects. The average overheads we receive, the overhead is the amount that goes to university for payment of electricity bills and other things. The average overhead we receive is 5%. And when we calculated how much money does it take to actually execute the project, because faculty members buy expensive pieces of equipment, they want air conditioning, they want electricity, a lot of things to be supported. Average money we spend on each project is about 11%. You spend 11% in execution of projects, you receive 5% as the overhead. Large projects are a big burden on these institutions right now. How many times have we represented the government saying, at least give some overheads on these research projects so that there is an incentive for institutions to push their faculty. Now we are all scared if a faculty member says, I have 50 crore project, now how do we support that project right now? In private institutions, what is the overhead? Minus 10%. Every project that BITS Pilani or Jindal or any of us go to government, they say how much money you will contribute, right? But where do we get money to contribute to those research projects? We have to keep increasing the tuition fee, and that is what it is right now. I think that lack of financial model, either for scale up, right? India's problem is not quality. India's problem is not scale. India is #1 in the world when it comes to number of universities. We have more universities than what US has, right? India's problem, therefore, is not of scale. I mean, 45 million students enrolled in higher education today. India quality is also not a big, kind of a thing. I mean, IITs, despite all these challenges, are still, receiving whatever money that they receive in the top 50 when it comes to engineering, because they are not multidisciplinary. Engineering top 50, IAC is still struggling, doing decently. So the quality is there in small numbers. India's problem is quality at scale. That doesn't exist. Why is the NEET problem the NEET problem right now? Because you have 20 aims, right? Today admit 2,000 students. 20 aims admit only 2,000 students. Now, there is, of course, 23 lakh students, 2.3 million students wanting those few seats. Obviously, there will be all kinds of scandals and all of that. All that we need to do is create that quality at scale. That needs a financial model. That needs to be, the financial model needs to link to outcomes. If you do this much of research, you get this much of money. If you do this many, if you admit this many students, you get this much of money. You collaborate with industry, receive this money, here is your incentive for that. You do research, this is your overhead. There is nothing like that. In the absence of that, all these things were known. There are committee reports after committee reports. He knows Vijay Raghavan knows that there was J.N. Sinha at that time, and J.N. Sinha, we got in McKinsey, right? And we had a wonderful report. Everything was good, but we thought now everything will happen. But then the minister changed and everything got shelved. I think this is the biggest challenge in India today. I think if we can fix that financial model of these institutions, I can tell you our institutions can actually, flourish, right? That's all what is basically in these educational institutions.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for succinct and punchy comments. Much appreciated. I just made a note of 3 things that struck me as sort of themes across the comments. I'll just list them here. It's just my framing of what I heard, for whatever it's worth, and then maybe we can take up one of those, and then I think we should just open it up to the audience. The first is that I didn't hear anybody speak about the thing that I, as a full-time professor in a leading American university, hear day in and day out, which is research and teaching are 2 sides of the same coin. Period. This is like, Americans would say, motherhood and apple pie, that you teach what you research, otherwise you don't do it well. And unless you teach well, you don't learn what the cutting edge problems are. And teach, of course, means teach at all levels. I teach heads of state, I teach bureaucrats, I teach undergraduates, I teach tycoons of industry, and every one of those interactions is a feeder to my research. So that's one. I'm just surprised that we didn't hear that at all. I take the point, and it's a very interesting point, that as Shamika, as you said, that the revenue model for research is broken or doesn't even exist, in effect. I was telling my fellow panelists, when in a conversation that we were having before the panel, I relayed a comment made by somebody to me today in the government, saying that if you look at the manual, I believe the acronym is GFR. What is GFR? General Financial Rules. Nowhere in the entire report, this is what governs what bureaucrats would be willing to authorize for expenditure purposes, to state it loosely, since I'm not an insider in this bureaucracy. There is no notion of risk anywhere in the GFR. If that is true, that is such a foundational problem to everything, because research is about taking intellectual risk. If you can never price it and never understand that a large proportion of what you spend on research is going to end up in dead ends, and that's not unproductive, that is productive fodder for subsequent research, it's a real problem. It's no surprise that there's no revenue model for research at all. So that's my first theme. The second theme is, I think, Raj, what you said, percentage of higher education activity in the private sector is something like 70% or something like that, give or take. The percentage of students, faculty in the private sector in the United States is maybe 5% or 7%. Maybe it's 10, depending on what metric you actually use. And I'm just reflecting on that because I think it's a summary statistic for a lot of underlying resource misallocation. Education is a public good in the end. So you should expect to see a lot more stuff happen in the public sector. And if we are in a situation, by the way, it's the same thing in the health. I chair the Lancet, co-chair the Lancet Commission. It's the same thing. The rules don't allow us to recognize the private sector, but 80 or 90% of delivered healthcare on the ground is in the private sector. Again, there's something wrong with that. Health is a public good. It should be in the public sector. But the reason we have the private institutions in all these is that the public sector is not delivering what it needs to. And the last comment that has again come up in a variety of comments is that the financial tail is wagging the research dog, right? Or the higher education dog. That we've got a set of financial rules, and that's really what everybody's dancing around in some sense. The problem, as Ram Gopal was saying, is not in the talent, is not in the intent, it's not in the creativity, it's in the enabling infrastructure, which is perhaps deficient. Let me ask if anybody wants to comment on any of this, maybe the research and teaching or the public-private mix, something of that nature. Do you want to go first?
I just want to talk about the funding part of it, because clearly the higher education sector has not adequately received the resources over the last several decades, and it's beyond politics. But one of the things that has emerged, and there may be few institutions, is that a very enlightened, progressive, liberal, and not-for-profit philanthropic model that has emerged in the last several decades. And of course, older institutions such as BITS Pilani and Manipal, but also in recent times, there are a number of new institutions which have emerged where we have seen, so for example, you talk about research, we are a research-oriented institution where we maintain a 1:9 faculty-student ratio. Now, one of the big challenges in a public institution to be able to create that research ecosystem is that the typical faculty members have, say, 22 to 26 hours of teaching a week. We have a cap of not more than 8 hours of teaching in a week. So you need to create that ecosystem for faculty to have time and to be able to, and as Dr. Rao said, we have zero overheads when it comes to institutional overhead, so that faculty members are able to be supported for that. The point is, there is a case for having a substantial increase in this idea of not-for-profit institutions with a fairer amount of regulatory barriers removed so that we can achieve our fuller potential. And clearly the IOE policy was intended. In many ways, there are enough possibilities for people like our benefactors to put in resources. I mean, my own benefactors so far put in 2,600 crores in this university, and there is more appetite to do it. But constantly, we are struggling with confusion and new levels of taxation, including new ideas of GST imposed on certain aspects of higher education, new ways to recognize, somehow bring the not-for-profit institutions into that framework. That's where we need to build consensus. And of course, both Dr. Rao and I should go back to a counseling session with Dr. Vijay Raghavan for all what we struggle on a day-to-day basis.
And I'll just welcome my panelists to add anything that they want to.
On at an undergraduate level or research, I think fundamentally I'm a researcher. I also teach. It's been 20 years since I've been teaching. I only teach because I love teaching. I don't really need to do it. And I think for us who work in policy, it's good to have one foot in academia simply to maintain a certain sanity. And also it's good to think 20 hours on one particular issue and think through it. Also, the classroom is a very sacred space where you can discuss and have all kinds of uncomfortable conversations. So for that, I think it's purely for my own mental health that I continue to teach. But at an undergraduate level, you don't really need, you need to read research. You need good case studies or materials which are relevant to the society which you are educating. So in fact, in 2005, when we started the whole econ finance area at ISB, which is my core responsibility at that point, we had very few cases, business cases. So in fact, it was mostly translational research. A lot of it was just putting together Indian data for the benefit of students. But very gradually, we realized that, that marginal value that you're putting into contextualizing certain existing research or just replicating it for the Indian case has tremendous value. Because not just because the problems are, I think there are uniquely Indian problems, but also it helps you think through uniquely Indian solutions. And at that point, we realized that an area such as microfinance, it's a very small area, but at that point I was fascinated by it. You realize that it's a small industry, but it was like a laboratory where there was so much experimentation that a lot of the successful product designs or new learnings on financial literacy really found their way into the larger financial sector regulations, right? So whether we had the financial sector regulations of 2008 or subsequently, most of it came from these lab settings of this very small sector, seemingly innocuous. And of course, now that the government is a part of it, that sector has to morph into something else. But it just tells you that, it's not research in terms of cutting edge, new, a lot of it is translational research. And at an undergrad level, I think the value of that is immense. And I think we don't do enough of that as well.
One point. I think, if you are talking of research, if you look at the numbers, India today is ranked third in the world in terms of research publications for knowledge generation, right? But what is our problem? Our problem is we have actually, in fact, I have DST data to show you that per dollar spent, Indians can write more papers than anybody in the world, better than even Chinese, right? So we have become experts at that. So I think, but writing papers, when Prime Minister asks Principal Scientific Advisor, "Aap log ne kya kiya?" कुछ नहीं किया, publish किया. So that's the biggest challenge. When politicians ask, what has come out of this research, in what way these institutions have helped solve a problem, we are all not very confident about it. But of course, we all gather our wits and then answer it on all that. But the biggest challenge in India is the lack of academia industry collaborations, right? Research to innovation. Innovation is all about, generating value for research, right? On the innovation front, we are 48th or, whatever rank you want to give that, right? The problem is not research. The problem is applying that knowledge to solve a problem. But that's where industry is coming. India, according to Innovation Report, is ranked 66th in the world when it comes to academia industry collaborations, right? 66th in the world. Hardly anything you can name in any industry, contributing to any academic, using this research, engaging strongly with academia. That is our biggest problem. That is where a policy push would have happened. In fact, I caught hold of one minister recently, Union Minister. I said, "Ma'am, just ask in the parliament one single question: how much money these big multinationals have spent in India collaborating with academic institutions? One question in parliament, let Intels, IBMs, all of them show how much money they have actually contributed to, working with academia." She said, "Naina, if I ask that, I will never be made industry minister. That will be seen as very negative for the corporates." And that question never came up again. I have looked at you can look at the balance sheets of all these companies. They're actually spending more money on travel than in collaborating with academia. That is our biggest problem. The day industry collaborates with academia, the day government pushes them to policy reforms or some mandates, I can tell you great things can happen out of the same academia that we complain about in this country.
So Vijay, can I ask you a question about this? When you were PSA, you put together, I remember I worked on it with you a little bit, what you were alluding to also, the clusters of research universities in NCR, Hyderabad, Bangalore, to try to get them face-to-face with industry. Can you reflect on what happened?
See, there are, multiple aspects to what Ram Gopal and you brought up. And there are structural solutions top-down, such as forming clusters of institutions and getting them to work. But let me just invert this for a second and list out all the extraordinarily positive widgets which we have, the components which we have, which if they only were to come together bottom up, even with all these constraints, we could make big change. You take any topic in science and technology today, right? And many other areas also. There are no shortage of really high quality capability in India to understand the science and technology. So the understanding capability has scaled reasonably well. There's no doubt about that. The median quality has gone up, but the quality at the highest, the median quality is not at a very high level internationally, but it's gone up substantially. There are top laboratories in many places. As I said, they're disconnected with the universities. Now, our challenge is for all these problems which you've heard from Raj and Ram Gopal in particular, we see an articulation in public spaces. We see institutional leaders writing letters to ministers and trying to work to get the funds. But we don't see a bottom-up upheaval saying, you know, give me these flexibilities and I'll deliver A, B, C, D. It's more about, oh my God, I need to do my work. I need more money. From the government's perspective, that may be a correct call to hear, but it's not sufficient because the government gets exactly the same kinds of requests or demands from health, from agriculture, from shipping, from infrastructure, from everything. The finance secretary sitting down has a certain, pot, and that's a limited pot. And from that pot, today he has to distribute that. So we need to find a way by which, as bottom up, as higher education people, as scientists, can say that a modest investment, can pay off disproportionately. What are the kinds of promises we can make? We can say your petroleum subsidy is so much. I will ensure that it's reduced by 10% in the next 2-3 years because of I will apply science and technology in that direction. I will, save on energy. I will save on fertilizer subsidy. I will save on water use. These are all tractable problems which we have left to dinosaurs of government institutions and not engaged as public scientists. So this has been left to the IIRI, it's left to the CSIR. Those are, they're caught in a time warp. They cannot solve these problems, though they lay claim to be able to solve these problems. The solution lies in the broader ecosystem. The people can solve it, but they're not articulating that they are part of the solution. They're saying, "Wo kaam to ICMR ka hai, CSIR ka hai, that's not my job." So we must participate in national solutions if we have to also call to have these other kinds of changes happen. As a bus conductor in Delhi when I was in school said, if you want change, bring change. So we have to do that.
Let me pause for taking some questions, and then we can resume the discussion based on what I would like to do is maybe take 2 or 3 questions as a cluster, and then use that to trigger the direction that we can take the panel in. And by question, I mean not a preamble to your life story, but a simple question. Otherwise, I will cut you off. Okay, and please say who you are. This lady in the front here. Can you say who you are and ask your question?
Hi, my name is Shreya, and so my direct question to Ms. Shamika, you talked about, the system, I mean, the undergraduate, where we don't get to, understand the case study. We haven't been, when I did my undergrad, I was not, involved in case study. I wasn't even aware about it. Where my other friend who was studying abroad, each module had case studies with the companies. Each semester, every end of the semester, there was a case study. The companies were giving them, not a big companies, but the small companies. Do you think this can become to, us in future? I mean, not, to the future kids who will be doing their undergrad. Do you think so?
Okay, thank you. Let's take some more. The gentleman at the back there, yeah.
Hi, I am Akshay.
Can you just state your affiliation beyond
Yeah,
Akshay?
I'm Akshay. I'm Harvard Yenching doctoral fellow,
Okay.
and last year I have spent 1 year in China.
Okay, great. Thank you.
There's a lot to talk about China. So my experience in China is that in Tsinghua University or Peking University, as you are aware, they are making money. They have their own enterprise. They have their own investment. One of the biggest investment Tsinghua University have is Tsinghua Tongfa, which is a big enterprise right now and producing a lot of different things. So in regard to public universities in India, especially as we are talking about the fiscal challenges, what is the scope of public university making money? instead of relying on government, and how they can establish and do something in order to make money. And this is an open question to everybody.
Great, thank you. Perfect. There's a lady there, maybe she can.
Yeah, hi, I'm Sunita Agarwal. My question is to all of you. What I understand is doing a master's at Harvard and in Mumbai University, that in India we have a system where it's all memorization, while at Harvard it's a system of conceptualization. With case studies, it's more case of conceptualization. Do you think Indian people, teachers are trained to grade case studies, or will the internal biases come into the whole situation?
Yeah, go ahead.
The financial model, in fact, I've done a lot of work on that. I have a chart on, different continents, how different countries fund universities, what is their financial model. In a nutshell, look at Stanford, right? A private university. Their model is 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. 1/3 comes from tuition fee. The tuition fee Stanford collects is about 26, 27%, right? Almost 1/3 of the money comes from endowment funds that subsidizes the education there. Other 1/3 comes from the research overheads on whatever the research that happens in the Stanford. And of course, there is some other income which comes from medical schools and other things because they have a large medical school too. That's a diversified financial model, right? And so that is what India needs. In India, ideally, what should have been the financial model for IITs? It could be 1/4 kind of a model. I mean, 1/4 comes from government grants, right? And 1/4 comes from the similar endowment funds. For that, even the policies, if I have to create endowment in this country, and it's so much difficult, right, compared to creating endowments in the US. I tried doing it at IIT Delhi. We had, $1 billion endowment fund, but there's too many regulatory issues there. And again, the overhead component on the research that should contribute to 1/4 of that, right? And also, then you have tuition fee, of course, can be 1/3, 1/4, and all of that. Today, the tuition fee component at IIT Delhi is about 7%. IIT Delhi's 7% of revenues come from tuition fee. And that's a problem. I mean, if your tuition fee is only 7%, I already told you there is no money on overheads from research. So you are entirely dependent on Government of India for your sustenance. And the moment you go to anybody saying that I need money, I mean, nobody is so generous that, okay, you take the money, but I will not control you, right? The bureaucratic controls also happen because of the excessive dependence on government for the funding, and then no autonomy, nothing. NEP, if you look at, NEP is a great document. If you read it, written by the best people, all is well. But the implementation of it, this is now 4th year or 5th year, we are implementing NEP. We are implementing all the peripheral kind of things, right? The core of NEP is about autonomy of institutions. It actually talks about all of this autonomy and all of that nobody is talking about. If you implement NEP, which is unveiled by the Prime Minister of the country with so much of fanfare, I think all the institutional problems in this country will actually go away.
Ram, you didn't respond to his specific question though, which was, for instance, why can't IITs, which has so much intellectual capital, what stops them? I know your answer is going to be bureaucracy, but what in principle stops them from licensing their technology? This goes back to your industry collaboration point also.
No, but licensing, even if you look at Stanford, how much money does Stanford earn on licensing the patents and all of that? It's not whole lot, right? I mean, if your budgets are $4 or $5 billion, what you earn through licensing is $100 million, $200 million kind of a thing. I think the licensing of what IITs earn today, a few crores, and the IIT Delhi budget is about 700 crores, right? I think just by licensing, you can't really, run an institute.
But let me interrupt for a second.
Yeah.
If I may. What really happens is the licensing ends up with entrepreneurship in the Bay Area. Some of those become multi-billion-dollar companies. Guess where that ends up? In the Stanford endowment. So that is the thing that he's really giving an example of with the Tsinghua.
That we tried doing, right? I mean, IIT Delhi has 32 unicorn founders.
Yeah.
And
so
we went to them saying, why don't you give money, right? But they're all unicorns, right? They don't have real money. They all have valuations which make them that. The highest money we got was from Binny Bansal, right? And Sachin Bansal. They pledged 125 crores, right? But then, it's all over a period of time. The change of leadership in IITs, everything changes for every 5 years, right? I mean, they pledged to me, but they did not pledge to the current director. So therefore, so this continuity of leadership and all of that, I think this is a challenge, right? You need a continuity of leadership too. That's again comes back to governance, comes back to autonomy and all of these kind of.
In fairness, the culture of philanthropy usually takes a generation to kick in. So we are moving from, temples and masjids and schools and orphanages to institutional philanthropy. But please, both of you.
Different kinds of institutions will have to raise funds differently, right? If you look at the triple ITs, especially the Hyderabad one, I mean, I think the incubator is actually doing very well. And these are relatively new institutions. I think the whole concept of alumni relations and alumni contributing towards something that I think they understand in terms of transparency and what the institution is allowed to do. I think NEP is meant to push these institutions towards that direction. I think there is a fundamental flaw in the way we think public education ought to be free. I think there is a fundamental flaw in that. There is an equity argument. Several kids ought to receive state funding and support because they are bright kids and they have not had great opportunity. But can you imagine how much families are spending in getting into these kind of institutions? They spend tens of lakhs. And they go to Kota and they go to all kinds of places. So the willingness to pay for quality education is very high in this country. But then this whole paternalistic attitude, but milna free chahiye. Tuitions, you try raising tuitions in IIT. You see, so I think we also have to accept the gorilla in the room, that there's something fundamentally broken. And by the way, primary education is different. School education is different. That is why we have an RTE. Higher education ought to be thought through with a completely different philosophy. We cannot think of higher education like free for all. Phir yahi milega. And I think, somewhere the economics of it just stares us in the face all the time. On the case study, I think there are fantastic new cases which are being created, though I'm more a theory and old traditional economist. I think case studies are important, but I think there's way too much weightage. I'm sorry, this is a Harvard event, but let me just say it. Case studies are important, but I think fundamental core theory is as important. And I think training and all of that at undergraduate level is extremely important. But again, the larger point I was trying to make here is there is something broken in the relationship between academia and either policy or industry, the people who are your consumers of your research. So even the government, and I can speak more on behalf of government today because I'm in the government now for the last year and a half. But even before that, all the policy research I did was hoping somebody in the government will use it, right? The point is the core problems are there. And no matter how well and whatever, there are very few universities in India that are doing quality research that can inform policy. Now I'm speaking as a researcher and as someone who's looking at agriculture policy, education policy, what are the scholars that I have to go to? Which is why I think bureaucrats run to consulting firms, I'm sorry. And somewhere inside, there is an introspection, and I really feel bad about it because it's our community and we have to step up. Because consulting firms will give you, most of those are my own students. I have around 8,000 CXOs in the country today and across consulting firms, and they're very bright kids. But, a consulting project is not a substitute to fundamental good quality research, particularly in areas of social sciences, etc., including policy. So I think, and again, industry, I think to Professor Rao's question, I think industry is now, by the way, we seem like, people who are only discussing problems, but we're also at a cusp when lots of wonderful things are happening. For the first time, we're actually seeing industry spend money on research, right? And good things are happening. If you just look at, we have increased 10-fold the number of patents in the last 1 year. Right? So there are things happening, but it's just a collective anguish because, of course, we are all preaching to the choir. And thank you.
The anguish is because the potential where we could be and where we are, that's what makes you very, disappointed. Otherwise, India has a huge potential, brightest minds. I think if only they are empowered a little bit, I think great things would have happened in this country.
So let me take off from that last point about the potential. I think it's very important to see all the wonderful things despite all these problems, standing in quicksand, that Indian higher education has accomplished and Indian R&D has accomplished. Everything has come from very modest, publicly funded institutions. Our top biotech and pharma industry have come from people from our public sector moving. The entire petrochemicals of Reliance stands on the shoulders of Indian public sector companies and chemistry education. The Indian Space Research Organization, the Atomic Energy Organization, the Electronics Organization. I mean, these are not small achievements by any measure, anywhere in the world. And you might argue that, these are, by the way, not just come because of some magical self-organization. These have come from leaders coming up organically, who worked with the government, pushed against all odds and got things done. So the odds have always been there. The odds have increased disproportionately now because of a shortage of funds in terms of the growth of the enterprise, and the enterprise has also grown enormously. But again, more recently, we should not underestimate the successes and the contribution of leadership of institution builders. People in the older IITs, Ram Gopal and others, have brought the 5 older IITs to a really top level in terms of innovation and teaching and research. Many new IITs, that many of the new AIMS are doing better. The ISERs are doing fantastically. So I think these are all, the churn of bottom-up human resources is happening. As we deal with the policy issues, as we try to get more money into the system, it'll happen. Now about industry impact, one last point, Tarun. If we try to measure that I am Institute X, how much money did I make? That is an enterprise doomed to failure in isolation. You might be able to measure what impact you had on that sectoral ecosystem. If you ask, what do the cluster of institutions in Pune or Hyderabad or Bangalore have on the chemistry or the IT or the biotech ecosystem? Transformative. That impact on the economy should be credited to these institutions. And that should be a mechanism of saying that, look, you guys made this happen. Then the amount of money is enormous. But if you ask me, I invested 10 rupees in my innovation center and I got only, this much, can you run the institute? Answer is no, never.
I just want to quickly, on a lighter note, say that in one of the politicians remarked recently that you go to a car mechanic with a problem that the brake is not functioning, and after working on the car, the mechanic says that, well, I couldn't solve your brake problem, but I've made your horn louder. We need to recognize where the problem is with regard to higher education and universities. We are not at all challenging the fact that so many wonderful things have happened and there is enormous scope for those things to happen. But we do have a major challenge with regard to our universities, its governance, its functioning, and the kind of regulatory barriers that constantly stare at us. I want to tell Tarun, one of the things that you might want to consider is that if you remember at the dawn of independence, Harvard and MIT, but also other universities around the world, had a very strong mentoring approach towards some of the developments, both in terms of establishing and evolution of key institutions in India, be it some of the IITs and the IIMs. But for the last over, say, 60 years or so, that has not been the case for obviously a number of possibly barriers, difficulties, challenges. I do think that Lakshmi Mittal type institute within Harvard, there is a case for reimagining the idea of institutional mentorship, wherein Indian universities selectively could be identified where substantive changes could be initiated. Now, the reason I want to bring this here is that the appetite for change is quite significant. And just as we have these challenges, there is also a progressive and a radical-minded people within the government who wants to change as well. And they are looking for ideas. Now, unfortunately, some of these ideas it's far more difficult for it to be emerging within India and to be taken seriously. Some of those ideas which comes from outside may possibly be taken more seriously. And that's why we need to revive the mentoring framework as well. I want to end by saying that despite all these challenges, there is also this huge appetite that is brought out by students in India. The 45 million people that Dr. Rao talked about. In the year 2009, we created this university literally in the villages of Haryana, where we began with 100 students and 10 faculty members and 20 administrative staff in 2009. We are now a community of 13,000 plus students from over 100 countries, 4,000 faculty and staff from 50 countries. This has been possible barely in 15 years. So the appetite for change is quite significant, but we simply cannot waste any more time, because that aspiration that's happening in the public domain need to be addressed with a more determined set of reforms.
Let me jump off that last comment about the history of collaboration, if you will, between not just U.S. universities, but universities all over, and many of the institutions in India. There are lots of questions that my colleague Monica sent me from Zoom. So, and many of them are about collaboration. Vijay, I see you frequently in Cambridge. Cambridge. Both, but I see you more in my Cambridge. We'll leave it undefined. And Raj, I see at Harvard Law School all the time. I don't see you directly, but I imagine you have many collaborations. But can you reflect on what, I guess the question on Zoom, which is a superset of the question that Raj was asking, is what symbiotic role can be played between institutions here and outside, if any, within the constraints that we have right now?
No, this year, in fact, our admissions just over yesterday addressed all the incoming students. 10% of students in BITS campuses are admitted to the joint degree programs, the 2+2 programs, and including the joint PhD. These are with RMIT in Australia, Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, SUNY Buffalo, State University of New York in Buffalo, and Iowa State University. With these two universities, we have 10% student. We just started it last year. This year, already 10% students. So I think now that's one thing which NEP has done, that internationalization part of it. It enables us now to offer 2+2 programs. Before that, we could not have done that. So I think we are all utilizing it. But then IITs will have a problem doing 2+2, right? Because who will pay the tuition when the student goes there? That's a big challenge for them. No IIT can do 2+2 with any university abroad. But we in the private sector can do that, because we can only admit students who are willing to pay that money, to the merit and all of that. I think there are still, IITs will have a problem, but private universities, I can tell you, will have significant collaborations with good universities abroad.
Yeah, so I think, the current model of international collaboration has to move on from the model of 70 years ago, which was very valuable in many contexts then, to what is feasible and valuable today. Today, a context like India is the most fertile intellectual ground for every single major problem the world faces. And therefore, international collaboration must be viewed from that perspective. How does one solve those major global challenges? By anchoring ourselves here. And we should drive those international collaborations and lead them in a multi-pronged manner. As opposed to earlier where we said, we have a problem, we need to set up a university, can you come and help us, right? That has to be flipped now, because we have an intellectual capital here. We have all the problems we have about, flexibilities and so on, but they can be overcome. And there's an eagerness amongst intellectuals all over the world to collaborate in this manner. So whether it's the most fundamental research or the most applied, there's a great possibility in collaboration. Some of those are going on. I mean, I don't have time to address those, but I think there are many examples in some of our big scientific missions where that's happening.
Let me give a specific example of that. There was a gentleman who asked a question in the previous session about rising sea levels in the Bay of Bengal. And I don't know if he's here. He may have left. That's actually an example of what Vijay is talking about. Whether you see extreme heat. So we at the Mittal Institute are sponsoring a very large study of individual level heat exposure to ambient heat. Unfortunately, India is a site where there's lots of exposure of informal workers to ambient heat. And this is a team of really the best climate scientists, epidemiologists, medical doctors, economists, at least in North America, coming together to say, let's collaborate with SEWA in Gujarat and use the fact that we have trusting relationships with them and that SEWA has trusting relationships with its women members, and get permission from the women to embed sensors on themselves 24/7 for a full year so that you can actually track endogenously what their exposure to heat is. You'll be surprised by the kinds of results that emerge from something like this. That's the first of its kind study in the world anywhere. Or the Mittal Institute sponsored a leading lawyer from Harvard Law School who was an advisor to President Obama in the prior administration and had gotten very interested in climate change in the city of Charleston, South Carolina, which turns out to be a coastal city on the East Coast that not only is one of the lowest lying lands in the United States, but is also the most racially segregated city. So it's a unique confluence of social inequity and climate disaster that is going to be, well, disastrous in the years to come. And she said, the place that I can most understand that is coastal Bengal and coastal Bangladesh. So that's what Vijay is trying to say, that we have, unfortunately and fortunately, lots of natural experiments occurring, okay? And this is in the same vein as Shamika's example of microfinance teaching us about much more fundamental issues in finance that transcend microfinance. So we can find so many examples of this in this very large and diverse country of ours, that if we can reorient and say that we will be equal contributors, I prefer not to be thought of as a mentor to Indian institutions at all, but it's equal contributors now, and collaborate on research, I think it would upgrade everybody in some ways. And that's what the Mittal Institute is set up to do in some ways. So I think that's an appropriate point at which to ask you all to help me bring this to a close by thanking our panelists for taking time and for this free-flowing inquiry. Thank you so much.
Though we all sounded negative, but as the saying goes, whatever you say about India, the opposite is also true, right? So therefore, I think though we talked only about what can improve, but there are great things that are happening. So I think we all should keep that in mind too. So
Keeping that positive note, I just want to say a quick thanks at the end. First to this institution, which helps us host so many events. Thank you. It's a wonderful, positive thing here in Delhi in India. I want to thank FAST again for their partnership. I also want to thank our team. Our team has done a wonderful job. It's one of 5 events we're doing this week. Let me just thank them by name. It's Monica, Shushmaji, Amit, Shreya, Angarika, Mohini. They're all here. And since we're talking about scholars and scholarship, we have a group of extraordinary scholars in the room. So I just want to say we have Robert Rahman Raman, who is Rinan Shah, Ajmal Khan, Pradeep Chaudhary, who are Mittal Institute Fellows. We have Chandrabhan Prasad, a great researcher and scholar who's also now affiliated with the Mittal Institute. And we also have the director of the Fulbright Fellows in India here. So thank you all very much. And let's all leave before the rain keeps getting worse.